this video, I want to continue the conversation that we started in the last video, just talking about how I think policy teams could be better responding to arguments from Moten and Harney on the intellectual properties protections resolution. I definitely think this is an important conversation to have because I definitely think that Moten is someone who is like very endemic to talking about like academic standards, social science study, and just the various ways in which we come to understand and think about the world and study it has, I think, a lot to bear, both on the question of politics and on the question of just like study as a whole in relationship to intellectual property protections. And so I would definitely say, if this is like your first time kind of hearing one of these videos, go back and at least watch the last video that I did talking about like an intro to how policy teams should be responding to it, because I think it does a good job of like beginning what I think is like some of the better arguments that you use to frame a lot of the advice that I'm going to give in this video. And so a lot of it is like really useful context, in my opinion, for the things that I'll kind of be talking about throughout this entire video. If that video kind of like is even still confusing, I think a helpful tool would be going back to the intro to Moten and intellectual property protections lecture, because that lays out what I think are some of the strongest arguments that Moten is making on intellectual property protections, which I think can help you understand why some of the things that I'm saying are the advice that I'm giving about how you should respond to this specific brand of argument, because I think just really responding to it generically and the way that you like would respond to like Afro-pessimism or other like things under Black study does a disservice to like what your best possible strategy could be against something like this. And so I think that all of it's just about like how can we build like a more stronger strategy that really prioritizes beating like the strong strengths of what people would read if they're reading about this resolution, and what will that look like. So just drawing from the conversation that we had in the last video, I kind of want to just talk a little bit about what I think the link debate looks like and how I think you should be responding to the link debate on this type of criticism. I feel like this is a place where most of the critiques that come from Moten's area would really struggle in the context of the ad, and I feel like most of the links are definitely going to be advantage based and not really like plain text action based. I feel like although there are definitely probably some good arguments to be made about like the international system and just intellectual property protections as a field as a whole, the way in which I think the way in which that kind of comes out in a lot of the stuff that Moten is writing about is a much more kind of like structural relationship to like how policy acts as a whole, and not really a relationship of I think specific like indites of instances of policy. And I think that can like often underserve the team that's kind of like reading the Moten argument from having specific examples or having really strong structuring claims about like the frame of the international. I think if that's the case for the team that you're debating, a lot of the arguments that you want to start making from here are really questions that weigh the difference between the link articulation and that of the status quo. I think making a lot of strong pushes against why the particular framing of their link argumentation as the 1AC just continuing to be part of the system of the status quo does actually set a basis for like how we're able to engage politics reliably, and like what the standard for like affs solvency should be. And I think things like that can be really important for you to start getting to weigh like some of the specific like strong kind of like examples about what your affirmative does to kind of change the way in which the field of intellectual property protections exists in the status quo in whatever way. And I think that every example you can give of the difference between like before and after are really interesting, strong snapshots of the ways in which your arguments kind of like take hold, and the way that they kind of like form themselves in relationship to various other sources of like advantage ground based like arguments that people kind of like start going into, like, you know, just like the idea of like, you know, economic logic being bad and the prosperity of economic logic over lies being bad, etc., or the idea that like the world system as a whole isn't something that isn't already coercive, etc., etc. And I think that when those types of arguments come along, you have a lot of arguments to kind of give about like why intellectual property protections is something that is like so kind of like sealed off from normative like public dialogue and public conversation, that even the 1AC kind of like being part of like a key section of like what this conversation is looking like and evolving into is like really important for the way in which we're able to like think about like how the field of intellectual property protections look, and it's probably like the most direct effect we can have on the way in which that particular field is able to orient itself, even if it means we should also do stuff outside of the line of policy. Which is why I think when you kind of like start turning this into like what the permutation looks like, a lot of the arguments you want to make is not even just a question of whether or not the alternative by itself can like fail or not, but rather a question of like why the alternative and the affirmative like have these kind of like incomplete modes that are part of them that make them like co-constitutive. And I think that if you're really like being smart about this, the type of affirmative that I think would be really smart to read against like a lot of the arguments that Moten is reading here is one that isn't based on being able to just like mess around with like how the US is able to orient itself on the international stage, but to actively talk about some of these other countries with like less power and less influence in places like like the WTO, and the way in which their relationship to intellectual property protections is kind of like already coded by various types of like international coercion through like economic profit, colonial extraction, etc. And then to say that the kind of removal of intellectual property protections in the way that we know it right now is a significant step in like a decolonial kind of like step for countries like these. And I think that if you are going to do like a more US-centric model, then a lot of your arguments needs to be about why the kind of like impacts or mutual exclusivity claims that they're making about the alternative in the AF are inevitable based off of things that are outside of the scope of the AF, but the AF still is necessary to create a more sustainable world for the alternatives, like alternative type of study or resistance to continue to exist. And that type of way of starting to build the basis of like strong net benefits and strong examples can be a really good place to kind of like make this permutation articulation make a lot more sense regardless of what type of affirmative you're reading. Because then when you kind of start transitioning into like the impact comparison debate, I feel like a lot of this question is definitely going to be more on the side of like what are the ethical ways that we're willing to live, and like how does our kind of like social dedications to what we're willing to like live and die for change the way in which like our relationship to policy, what policies we're willing to pass, and what violence comes with those things. And I think that these are all really important questions that I think on your side have to be answered by just the question of like how we make decisions in debate, and why even if they're right about the kind of like ethical decisions that they're talking about and the portions of ethical offense that they're making, the idea that the judge can then be an arbiter for that in order to sacrifice the well-being and lives of people internationally is also a kind of like colonial idea of like control, and like the idea of just the role in which they play in the first place. And so the only type of valuation that we can have is one in which like values life equally and allows us to kind of like make calculations based off of those things. And I think doing so can allow you to make a lot of like really strong arguments for why your model impact comparison is the one that's most sustainable for the type of conversation that should be had in debate. And then when you're moving into the alternative, it's really just a question of just like pushing all these arguments about like why the alternative at a material basis can't resolve itself faster than the affirmative, and using like all of the things that the affirmative does politically as barriers against how the alternative is able to kind of like resolve those questions and is able to like make the world more sustainable in order to continue this type of resistance and change the way in which the world is constituted. And without that, I feel like there's so much offense for you to weigh to make the possibility of a permutation and other types of arguments or an impact outweigh strategy so much more prominent, and therefore just like much more sustainable against this type of negative strategy as a whole. So hopefully this video was helpful, and hopefully it'll give you a better idea of how you as an affirmative team can respond to Moten's arguments that are usually right on the negative. And yeah, hopefully you'll keep listening to this series and tuning in. Thanks.